then she laid down in the floor. Well, when I found her,
There she is laid out. Yeah.
there she was laid out in the floor. But she got over that pretty good. And Monday, she didn't feel good. Elbow was hurting. Well, by Tuesday, she couldn't use her arms. She called urgent care. They gave her an appointment for 6 o'clock in the afternoon because she was going to finish the day's work. Well, it got so bad until she called and there was that 6 o'clock appointment up to 3 o'clock. When she got, by the time she got to the urgent care, they were giving her the good pain medicine. There was, she had a little knot on it. It was hot, and they did an X-ray. There was no breakage. They sent her to an orthopedic doctor, and he said it's gout.
You know, I've always heard of gout in the feet, but I've never heard of it in the elbows.
Any joint. I thought gout in your elbow. He said yes, it happens all over your body. And I thought,
Did not know that.
yeah. So, she's out of her rapid, and she's off of her medication except for steroids. Because she had a fever and they thought there might be some kind of infection, but that's what it was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Not what you want, but I guess it's better than some things could be.
It's a lot better than some things that she could have broken something but no. And she said the bad part was she didn't have a good story.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for choosing to be here this morning. Barring strong objection, I will begin in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. Hearing no objections, I'm going to actually begin in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, as an introduction to our study in 1 Peter. In Romans 13, Paul writes thusly, excuse me, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, period. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God, period. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment, period. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who has authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he's God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Now, 1 Peter 2 and 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed, for you were like straying sheep, but now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Excuse me, please. All authority has been established by God, and there's no authority except that God established it. Do we really believe that? I mean, it's written right there. Sure, we're going to say I believe it. How about that idiot who got his job through nepotism, that's your boss, and he don't know anything about anything? You ever had one of those? You betcha. Why? He's there because God put him there. Does God put evil people in authority over good people that they cause them harm? How many times did God bring the Philistines or other folks against the Israelites and defeat them? I don't know. Why? Why did God raise them up to do that? Because the good people were misbehaving. Why did God allow the Hebrew people to be raised up in captivity in Egypt for 400 years and be slaves and treated cruelly? Not so much. He created an environment to grow a nation. They were protected as a nation and being allowed to grow so that he could bring them out as a strong nation. And they were learning the consequence of sin, if you will, of bitterness, in order to be able to appreciate and taste the goodness of God and his freedom, which they didn't do a very good job of appreciating. They wanted to go back. Freedom can be a difficult thing to live with. In verse 16, Peter writes, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Do you remember being a child maybe moving into the teen years, thinking, I cannot wait to get out of this house. I cannot wait to be on my own. Anybody besides me? Okay. I don't remember thinking, I cannot wait to get out of here to get a job and go to work every day. I don't remember thinking, I cannot wait to get out of this house so I can find a place to live and pay rent. I don't remember thinking, I can't wait to find my place in this world and pick up my burden and carry it by my... I remember thinking, I can do what I want when I get out of here. These mean parents that I have, and some of you met my mom, you know what I'm talking about, are holding me down. They're holding me back. They're not letting me live. They won't let me have fun. I don't know where they came from, but they have no concept of fun and living and having friends and going places and doing. They just don't get it, and I need to do that. This verse comes to mind. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil. I wanted my freedom to do what I wanted to do. Not for what I could do for anybody else. Not for any really good purpose other than I want what I want. And I don't want anybody to get in my way. Thankfully, they had authority. If I ask you for a very, very short definition of authority, what would you say? Who said that? I thought so. That's usually what's said. Anybody else?
The person who holds you responsible, or the person anyway that holds you responsible and accountable.
Authority is, unless I spend 3 or 4 hours on this today, and I don't think you'll stand for that. Are you wanting to modify your answer now?
No, I don't want to modify it. Sometimes what people say is not what other people hear. But
Yes, ma'am.
with authority comes responsibility.
I would go so far as to say authority is responsibility. When you have the responsibility of doing something, you are given whatever you need to be given to do that, to uphold that responsibility.
It's been said that liberty or freedom, this weekend being a good time to think about that, is the freedom to do as you ought, not the freedom to do as you want.
Yeah, I never cared for that. I want to do what I want. Yes, ma'am. I hear on television all the time, when politics, who's got the power. Power is strength. You have that kind of, you think of authority in the military as being strength. They, the guy in authority over you has got the strength to make what he says go. Authority, well, I could go on and on. I'm not sure where I want to stop. Authority is given by God to suit God's purposes. God gives authority to positions rather than people. He gives authority to kings, presidents, emperors, despots. He gives authority to elders. He gives authority to parents. He gives authority to those who bear a responsibility. And when you have a responsibility, you have to do what's necessary and right to carry out that responsibility, which means you accept some authority. Those who are going to be working with you will be under your authority, under your direction. When one is in a position of authority, he's also in a position of service. The kings, the presidents, are supposed to be providing services to those they oversee. Their responsibility, their authority is for those they oversee. If the president has authority over the people, he has a responsibility to the people to protect, to provide, to do these kinds of things. Parents have authority over their children, which means early on providing an awful lot of physical care, and then begin incorporating other kinds of teaching and encouraging and training in order to fulfill the parents' responsibility. They have to begin serving these children in a way that serves them so that they can become the kind of people they need to be. Elders in a church have an authority, but they have a responsibility. Do you have a note from the office? She does. So when we think about authority, one being authority as one who is providing a service or being serviceable to those they oversee, it kind of takes on a different. When a man has authority in his family, and it comes time, the summer's here, and he says, it's time to go on vacation. We're going to go fishing the whole time over here at my favorite fishing hole. Well, that might work once or twice, but after a while, the family's going to say, we don't want to do that. My dad didn't like fishing. He thought it was time to paint the house every summer. Well, I don't want to do, you're going to live here, you're going to do what I tell you to do. Anybody ever hear that or say that?
It's understood.
If we were to think of authority as responsibility, how would it change our way of thinking? How would it change our way of acting? How would it change the way we handle authority we've been given, and how would it change the way we respond to those who have authority over us? All authority was given to Jesus in heaven and on earth after he had shown his willingness and his ability to accept and exercise the responsibility God had given him. When Jesus had provided for God's greatest desire and man's greatest need, God gave him all authority. God gives authority to those who accept and exercise responsibility. He gives authority to positions, and the way you handle that authority determines in great measure how successful you will be. And if we want to handle our authority with a heavy hand, we probably won't be very successful, except maybe in the military, and that only goes so far. After a while, that's not tolerated. I dare say authority may be one of the most discussed and exampled things in Scripture. From the very beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's some authority there. In the wilderness with the Hebrews, authority continued forevermore was a problem. They didn't want Moses to have authority. They didn't want Aaron to have authority. They chafed at it. They barked at it. They rebelled against it. They paid for it, and still they came back and complained. They didn't want God to have authority. They wanted to determine their own, and this is where we are weak because we don't understand authority. Authority has, for all of my life, been a bad word. And one reason is because many of those who had authority used the heavy-handed "you will because I said so" approach. I'm in charge and I'll break you. If a father's authority depends on his strength, that's only going to last so long. And one day that 19-year-old boy is going to say, I challenge that. And he might be stronger, faster, and meaner than Dad. Then where's Dad's authority? If your authority is dependent on a heavy hand, that's only going to go so far. And one day you won't have the heavy hand. One day you'll lose that strength. One day you'll lose that power. And then authority has to be something that people are willing to yield to. How do you get people to yield to authority?
Be righteous. Advocate for the right cause.
Show respect to get respect.
Respect is thank you for bringing that up. Respect is the modern term for authority. Among the young people, they talk about respect. You respect me, I'll respect you. It's not quite the same thing as authority, but it's as close as one can get without saying authority. When I was young, I was very concerned about how one gets authority, how one uses authority, how one maintains authority, how does one lose authority? If we can't address those questions and understand them, we are going to have a difficult time understanding God and understanding how God operates in this world through governments, teachers, parents, and the church. We need to have a study on the subject of authority from a biblical perspective, not to show that scriptures are authoritative, not to show that elders are authoritative, but to understand God's concept of authority. And then all these other things will fall in line. Questions, comments, discussion, confrontation? Yeah, confrontation, here it comes.
No confrontations. Authority is kind of parallel to leadership. Leadership being represent authority. And I've always been told that Christ was a shepherd leader. And you lead sheep, but you drive cattle. And some people in authority try to be drivers, crack the whip. And but I thought that was a good illustration. Shepherds lead, I guess cowboys drive. Or authoritarian, or people who take their authority as a vice or power and control over those under them. And control, I think, is probably the word, is that you try to control the behavior rather than create an atmosphere of support and loyalty and trust in your leadership.
Yeah, I've noticed the discussion seems to be more on how you acquire power and how you yield it once you have it. But in verse 13, the point Peter's making is how you submit to it. It's the one who doesn't have power. That's where he's addressing right there. Submitting to the proper authority.
Yep.
Remember, Nero's on the throne when he's writing.
Yes.
He tells us to submit to the governing authorities. You know, one of the interesting things, that kind of the transition from the Old Testament to the New, is in the Old Testament we have a theocracy for one nation. But you move to the New Testament, suddenly you have a Christian nation, but it's planted within all other nations on the face of the earth, who are all told, no matter what kind of government they live under, you need to be good citizens under this government. Or, you know, whatever form of leadership that you have yourself. Are there bad leaders? Yeah, there's absolutely horrible leaders. He wrote it when Nero was a horrible leader.
And that's the point. That's part of the point he's in verses 18 and following. It does not matter what the situation is, you submit to the leader. You submit to the one in authority.
I wrote in the margin also Acts
You
5:29.
added two?
Yeah, I do it also. Acts 5:29, we must obey God rather than men. You know, there are times when situations are so abominable you have to take a stand against certain things. But in the regards to the regular affairs of life, you're supposed to be good citizens because the government comes from God.
You obey the authorities that God has put in position until those authorities violate God's authority or God's will. And when they violate God's will, you must remain true to God's authority. We usually don't give it that much time. We usually want to have a round, we usually want to have a firebrand discussion on politics. And we've all got our idea who's to blame and what's to blame and what do we need to do and what are they doing. And I'm pretty good to tell you what they're doing wrong. I'm not so sure I can tell you what's to be done right, but, you know. When I was growing up, they said you can't legislate morality. Well, I think that may be true, but I found out you can legislate immorality.
Jackie used to started his reforms when he was, I think he was 16 years old. He began to cleanse the kingdom. Well, actually, he sought after the Lord when he was 16. I believe when he was 20, he began to cleanse the kingdom. Tearing down altars. Every idolatrous worship became a crime. He used the force of violence. But he started doing it in his 12th year. You turn to the book of Jeremiah, who was preaching during the same period. He started his prophecies in the 13th year, which means the reform should be in place. He's been at it for a year. Jeremiah is depressing because of how evil the people were. Because even though the king's trying to reform them, their hearts aren't reformed. They're going to do what they're going to do behind the king's back. That's what they're going to do.
This verse 18 following, well, for one thing, verse 17, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Wow, that's a mouthful right there. That's a full-time job. And remember, Peter is very good about, or he likes very well to use these direct commands. There's nothing to be misunderstood about honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. I want to take another quick stab at verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. The requirement there is for everyone to subject themselves. I don't have to be beaten into submission. I shouldn't have to be beaten into submission. I should first and foremost be submissive to the authorities God has established. They don't have to earn my submission. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it's the emperor, the governors. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. You'll try that one again, Peter? Did you get lost in mid-sentence? You can't mean that. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? If you do wrong and you're beaten for it, what credit is it if you endure when you're beaten? None. You were unjust. You were beaten. But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. It should be expected. You've been called to suffer. Christ left you an example, and you've been called to follow. He committed no sin, neither was there deceit in his mouth. When he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but continued entrusting himself to who judges justly. Jesus Christ, no sin, unjustly accused, unjustly punished. Follow his example. Are you better than he? When the mean people and the mean authorities and your mean master punish you, beat you, confiscate everything you have, take away your liberties, submit. Who are you compared to who is Jesus? And Jesus submitted because it was God's will and he submitted. Chapter 3. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Seemed like I heard that last week. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. I grew up in South Alabama. One biblical principle that every South Alabama boy knew he knew was that he was king in his house, and his wife and his children were to be obedient to him. Well, that's not quite what it says. It wasn't his, he didn't have the authority to make his wife submit. He didn't have the right to make his wife submit. He didn't have the authority to require her to submit. It had nothing to do with him whatsoever. Wives, be subject to your own husbands. Even if some do not obey the word. He goes on to say, as Mike pointed out last week, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. That notwithstanding, be subject anyway. Submit anyway. We've kind of grown up believing that the husband was responsible somehow for making the wife submit, and that if he wasn't quite the man he was supposed to be, she didn't have to. That ain't what it says. It's a funny, funny thing that God tells the women to submit, the wives to submit, and he tells the husbands to learn to love the wife. Kind of the opposite of what we have a natural inclination toward, isn't it? We kind of want the husband to say, you will submit, and woman, you will love him. Well, that's good to be a king, isn't it? That's not what he says. Wives, submit, and guys, love them. It must be contrary to the natural inclination for women to submit to the authority of men. And it must be somewhat contrary to the natural inclination for men to love the wife instead of just lust after her. Many young men got married because they fell in lust. And I guess that happens to some females too, but that ain't love. Love is not an emotion. It's a choice. It's a decision. I may slam a few doors and tear some cabinet doors off the wall, but I'm going to love you anyway. I might just be expressing some frustration and some anger at myself or something, but no matter what happens, I'm going to love you. No matter what it looks like, I'm going to love you. I'm not going to cheat on you. I'm not going to do any of these. I'm going to love. That's what the oath is about. That's what the vow is about. It's, I promise I'm going to love you even when I don't look like I'm much in love.
Well, I always think of the passage that Christ loved the church, husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And I think in all cases, if husbands could see their wives within the context of that scripture, it would change a great many relationships.
I love this whole section that is given. Now, I want you to notice here, if you look in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, or 6 verses are for the women, 1 verse for the men. You know, there's probably some significance there. I'm not sure what it is. But 6 verses telling women to be submissive or to be subject. He keeps on going. He hits it and he hits it and he hits it. Now, to the men, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they're heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Well, I'm going to come back to that, but first I'll go back. Since he spent 6 whole verses on the women, I think we ought to spend some time there. Being a little bit facetious. Let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Some of the most beautiful women I've ever known were not pretty. Some of the prettiest women I've ever known were not nice. There was an episode of Gunsmoke on yesterday, and some lunatic had come into the Long Branch Saloon and was going to blow Miss Kitty away with a shotgun, because the prettiest is always the wickedest. That's what he said. Being pretty on the outside ain't got a thing to do with what's on the inside, except that you live long enough, you learn to question if that pretty is pretty on the outside and the inside. Neither of my grandmothers were pretty women, but man, were they the most beautiful women I ever met in my life. Wonderful women, Christian women, strong women. When it's all, you know, when both of you are 80 years old and you see them walking down the mall holding hands, they're not in lust, I don't think. They're in love. They probably don't even see what each other looks like, except they remember what they looked like when they married them, or they don't even care. Why? They've learned to love the person. They love and appreciate the person. And the looks, well, the looks come and go, and now you can buy them in bottles and in all kinds of ways. Women, just so you know, I've learned one thing by watching too much television. You can sell any product to women if you say it's got vitamins in it and if you call it by some French name. If you call it by some French name and you put vitamins in it, ooh, we got to have some of that. It's got to be good for you. Yes, sir.
In my experience over the years, particularly in college athletics, coaching women athletes and interacting with a lot of people across a number of states, I have found that there more you get to know them, the uglier they become. And the reverse is also true, that I won't say they were ugly, but they were ordinary, not your cosmopolitan type female, but the more you were around them, the more you got to know them, the type of person they were, the more attractive they became.
And the more you want to be around those people and to share with them, because they have quality. They're quality people. A great deal of Christianity is overcoming the natural inclination. That's a sound bite I use. I say it too fast. But Jesus said if somebody slaps you on the one cheek, turn the other. If he wants to take your coat, take your cloak, give him your cloak also. Do the opposite of what the natural inclination is. The natural inclination say, "Oh, that person is very attractive." Beware. Everything may not be quite as it seems. Superficiality is just that. You have to get to know somebody. I knew one time a very attractive woman who hadn't been churched, but her brother was a Christian, and she soon became, through a number of circumstances, started coming with him to church. And one day she decided to be baptized. It was quite an event for this woman with her perfectly made up face and her perfectly coiffed hair to be seen by the whole church looking like a drowned rat. Because that's pretty much what she looked like when she came up out of the baptistry. But that image went away immediately for that big smile. That big smile, those tears. Now we were seeing the inner person. The inner person was far more attractive than the outer person ever was. My time is up, and I thank you for yours. We'll pick up right about here next week, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise.